Well, good morning. If you've been with us during the season of Lent here at Christ Lutheran, we've been looking at the 7 statements that Jesus says in the Gospel of John, identifying himself. 7 I am statements. Today, we finished with the final one, and let me read for you portions of John chapter 11. So if you would just hold with me for a second. Now, a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Accordingly, though, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, and having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him while Mary stayed at home. And Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." And Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Well, grace to you and peace from God our Father and our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. What a wonderful day. What a beautiful day to gather and worship, and incredible worship so far. I mean, Teresa, wow. Thank you. You are awesome. And Noel's children message was pretty good too, wasn't it? In fact, thinking about Noel Thompson and his wife Rachel, congratulations to them. And they announced it today of her being pregnant. You're going to have your 4th child. That's pretty exciting. That was Rachel who said that. So, have you been to a good funeral lately? Now I know, for a lot of you, those two words, good and funeral, don't go together. They're oxymorons, right? See, I disagree. I think that there are not-so-good funerals, and there are good funerals. A not-so-good funeral is where you leave depressed. A not-so-good funeral is where there's a lot of tears, a lot of sadness. And a not-so-good funeral is where nobody serves you potato salad afterwards. But a good funeral, there are going to be tears. Tears are a given, and that's okay. But there's also going to be smiles, and sometimes even laughter. At a good funeral, you walk away and you say to yourself, "Wow, I hope they have a funeral like that for me when I die." And at a good funeral, the church ladies feed you tuna casserole, potato salad, sliced ham, and afterwards everyone sits around tables and they drink coffee and they talk about the deceased. And they laugh and they smile some more. I just recently conducted my 250th funeral and ministry. And I have to tell you this, I like doing funerals. And that sounds weird, but I like them. I like doing funerals a whole lot better than I like doing weddings. You know why? Because there are no mothers of the bride at a funeral. No kidding. I hope that when people come to a funeral that I do or Pastor Mike do, I hope that they say, "Wow, that church knows how to put the F-U-N into funeral. Let me give you an example of a good funeral. Now, this is not one that I did. If I told one of my stories, it might hit a little too close to home for some people here today. So this story, I asked my friend Alfred. Alfred is an African-American Pentecostal pastor up in Northern California. And I said, Alfred, tell me the funniest moment in one of your funerals. Well, in his congregation, in his church, the custom is that they would have the casket up in front, and it's always an open casket. And then before the service, women from the congregation would come forward, and they would place flowers either on or in the casket. So now, Alfred sits up front, and he has like a bird's eye view of what's going on. And so this guy dies. He's in his mid-70s, and sure enough, at the beginning of the service, the women of the congregation come forward with the flowers. They put them in or on the casket. And then the deceased's sister comes forward. And sitting down with flowers, she has like a wad of cloth, and she drops it in the casket. She walks away. And after the service, Alfred said to her, Sister Georgia, I could not help but notice that you put something in your brother's casket today. What did you put in there? And she said, I put in his gym socks. And Alfred said, Sister Georgia, why forever did you put gym socks into your brother's casket? Well, she said, if he's dead, he can no more smell those gym socks than he can smell those flowers. But if he's not dead, those gym socks will wake him up sure as day. And when Alfred told me that story, he couldn't get through it without laughing, cracking himself up. He thought it was the funniest thing in the world. And you know what? It is hilarious. Why is it funny? Because Sister Georgia knew how to mess with a funeral. She knew what to do in order to cut to the chase and speak to the moment and to celebrate a life even though there are tears. And somewhere in that church's history, they began the understanding that even though there might be tears, there might be sadness, yet there can be smiles and there can be joy. That might sound silly for some of you, that you might find joy in a funeral. Because my hunch is that most people don't like going to funerals, at least not as much as I like to go to them. Because for a lot of people, they equate a funeral with death. And who likes to talk about death? And I know that some people would say that they would never be caught dead going to a funeral, which I think is the epitome of irony. Jesus went to a funeral, and it got him killed. I'm jumping ahead of the story. Let me back up a little bit. Jesus hears that his good friend Lazarus is sick, and you hear what he does? He doesn't do anything. He stays away. And by the time he shows up, Lazarus has been in the grave for not 3 days, 4 days. And you might think to yourself, well, Jesus, that's not very Messiah-like of you. Why couldn't you at least go those 2 miles and visit your friend while he was yet alive? Or better yet, why didn't you heal him? But Jesus stays away. And when he does show up, then he has those 2 encounters with Lazarus' sisters. To the first sister, Martha, both of them asked the question, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And to the first, Martha, he says, but I am the resurrection and the life. I mean, it's like a teachable moment for Jesus. It's a perfect opening for Jesus to do a little self-revelation of who he is for all people. I am the resurrection and life. Wonderful moment. But to the second sister, Mary, who asked the very same question, Jesus doesn't say hardly anything. Instead, he weeps. He weeps. So what in the world is happening in these stories? Let's start with the question of why did Jesus stay away? I hope that bothers you. It's supposed to bother you. I know that as a pastor, if somebody called me on the phone and said, my brother is sick, could you come and visit? If I wait 4 days to go visit that person, I'm going to hear about it. And so it's perfectly understandable that when you hear Mary and Martha asking the question, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died, there's an edge to it. This is not a convenient moment in Jesus' ministry. So why does he wait? Why does he wait? How many of you have seen the movie Princess Bride? Okay, a few of you. It's like our family's favorite all-time movie. We've seen it dozens and dozens of times. So if you haven't seen the movie, it's kind of set in the mythical time of princesses and princes and bad guys and, oh yeah, true love. Like, it doesn't happen anymore, but it used to happen a long time ago. True love. And Wesley is the good guy, and he's trying to win the hand of this woman that he loves. Her name is Buttercup. But in the process of winning her hand, he gets captured and tortured by Count Rugen. So he's dead. He's dead. And hoping for a miracle, they take Wesley's body to a guy by the name of Miracle Max, who can maybe do some healing. And so they bring Wesley to Miracle Max, and Miracle Max says, it just so happens that your friend here is mostly dead. He said there's a big difference between mostly dead and all dead. And then he proceeds to bring Wesley back to life. You see, in Jesus' day, that's exactly what people thought. They thought that after somebody stopped breathing, their soul was still alive inside of them, and that for 3 days, they would be placed in a tomb, and every day somebody would go to the tomb and say, hey, wake up! What's so important? And if they didn't wake up after 3 days, then they would be considered dead, and they would seal the tomb, and that would be it. So Jesus waits. He doesn't wait 3 days. He goes 1 extra for good measure. He waits 4. And then he shows up at Lazarus' grave. And for all gathered there, it's total agreement. Lazarus is all dead. But why the tears? Clearly, this is a not-so-good funeral, because there's a lot of sadness going on. And do you find it strange that the Son of God would cry, would weep at a moment like this? I mean, doesn't Jesus know what's going to happen? Doesn't Jesus have some idea how this is all going to unfold? Why does he weep? My presumption is that every person here, every one of us, has cried in our life. And we know that tears do happen when we're sad, when we grieve. But tears also happen at other times of life. How many of you have cried when you're really happy? Like when your child was born, you cried, didn't you? Some of us. Or have you ever cried when you're lonely and depressed and feel like everyone's abandoned you? There's tears that you would cry at that time too. Well, there's also tears that we cry when we feel outrage, when we feel anger, when we feel really feeling like the moment is not fair and that there's something wrong with what's happening. Some years ago, when I did our first mission trip, when I came to Christ Lutheran Church, we did a mission trip where we're going to go into Tijuana and work in Tijuana for a week. And I went with my friend Eric, who's also a pastor, and we decided that before our churches would go together, that he and I should go down and kind of scout out the area and see where we're going to be staying and see the work that we were going to be doing. And so the host that was taking care of us and showing us around took us to kind of a hillside, and we came up on top of this hill, and we're looking down at a garbage dump. I mean, literally, it's a garbage dump. There were trucks coming in and dumping waste. And there were people living in the garbage dump. There were tents in the garbage dump. When the trucks came and unloaded their waste, children would run into that waste and start looking for things that were salvageable. And Eric and I stood on this bluff looking out at this garbage dump, and we said to ourselves with tears in our eyes, this isn't right. People should not be living like this. I don't think Jesus weeps because he's overcome Jesus weeps because he is angry at what death does in destroying relationships, in hurting people that he loves so deeply. I think Jesus weeps because he is now passionately all in doing whatever he can to defeat the power of death and by virtue defeat the power of the devil. And so he does something about it. He raises Lazarus, who was all dead, from the grave. And understand, just for Lazarus, this is a moment in time. He will die again. But in this moment, Lazarus receives an incredible gift. But as I said earlier, it's going to get Jesus killed. You don't raise people from the dead and have it go unnoticed. And the religious authorities of the day would not have anybody raising people from the dead on their own without permission from the religious authorities. And so you know the rest of the story, right? They end up arresting Jesus, beating him, crucifying, and killing him. Jesus doesn't get to have a funeral. Things happened so rapidly on Thursday when he was arrested that by the afternoon on Friday, he was dead. And they put him in a tomb and they sealed the door and everyone went home sad. But 3 days later, did you get that? 3 days later, Mary Magdalene shows up because she's feeling so incredibly sad, knowing that if no one else is going to come, at least she's going to be there to have a funeral. And it's not going to be a good funeral. It's going to be one of those funerals that will be deeply sad. Why? Because when Jesus died, all of Mary's dreams died. You see, Jesus was her whole point and purpose for living. But he's not dead. The not-so-good funeral turned out to be, actually, well, not just a good funeral, maybe the greatest funeral that has ever existed. Because Jesus was alive. And because he was alive, there is a promise now that death has lost. A promise that there no longer needs to be any more not-so-good funerals. All funerals now can be good funerals because Jesus has the final word on everyone's death. Therein lies the greatest significant difference between a not-so-good funeral and a good funeral. The difference is Jesus. It's Jesus who is the one who is the self-proclaimed resurrection and the life, and then he went on and he proved it. And so if you go to a funeral and somehow walk away not having heard that Jesus is the resurrection and the life, then you might ask for your money back because you got ripped off. You were deprived of hearing the gospel. You were deprived of walking away with the gift of hope. You may not like going to funerals, but here's something I know. You will go to at least one, your own. And if I get a chance to do that service, if I am the officiant of that service, you can be sure of two things. The first thing is that we will talk about you as one for whom Jesus' victory over the death has had eternal implications. The second thing you can know about your funeral, if I get a chance to do it, is that we will have potato salad afterward and we will talk about you. But help a preacher out. Live as if now you believe the good news that Jesus is the resurrection and the life and that it has changed everything for you. Do things that will create stories that can be spoken about you at your funeral. Stories that speak about your faith, that speak about your kindness, that speak about your willingness not to take yourself so seriously, but to focus on the needs of others, doing things that allow others to know how deeply you love Jesus. Go ahead. Put smelly socks into a casket. Do whatever is necessary to draw attention not to yourself, but to this God who has given you life and promises life everlasting. Be the kind of person who, because God has a grip on your life, that you might have the greatest confidence of God's grace. So much so that when people attend your funeral, they will walk away and say, hope they do one like that for me when I die someday. A Christian isn't somebody who is better than others. A Christian isn't somebody who's got it all figured out. A Christian isn't somebody who's a Bible expert, by no means. A Christian is simply somebody who lives with the end in mind. Because for them, death does not have the final answer. In fact, death is the greatest April Fool's joke that will ever be played, and we will laugh our way all the way into the embrace of our loving God.